Welcome back, Ultima Weapons. It's the Night Sky Prince again. Final Fantasy X was one of my favorite games of all time. I've played through this game more than half a dozen times, and each time I got hooked into it by its flawless narrative and excellent implementation of the conditional turn-based battle system. Nothing fascinates me more than to know how a game I love this much was created and the process to bringing it to fruition. Back in the year 2000 at the Square Millennium event, a private event to display Squaresoft's new cutting-edge projects, they decided to publicly show off the next 3 Final Fantasy games. Final Fantasy IX, a final swan song for the PlayStation 1 that would be a fond look at the past and would release later that year. Final Fantasy X, which Square aimed to be their most ambitious RPG ever created, and Final Fantasy XI, which planned to take the series into the rapidly developing world of MMORPGs. During which, they showed off a trailer for Final Fantasy X, which looks quite different than the Final Fantasy X that we ended up receiving. The trailer starts off with the headline, "Dead for 1,000 years." This is in reference to Tidus, who originally wasn't planned to be a Dream of the Faith. In the original script for Final Fantasy X, Tidus was actually a citizen of the original Zanarkand, and he was killed during the attack with Sin, you know, the same one in which Auron ends up saving him from. So why did this change? If you honestly think about it, Tidus being dead for 1,000 years and just being unsent, and Yuna having to send her unsent love all sounds pretty intense. However, The Sixth Sense was an extremely popular movie and features a very similar plot twist. Squaresoft admits, to avoid looking as though they plagiarized this idea, they changed Tidus to be a Dream of the Faith instead. We are then met with a strikingly different logo. This logo is honestly pretty cool. It surprises me in hindsight that they actually changed it, as it's pretty rare for Square to have Yoshitaka Amano redo any of his work. Gameplay footage begins and we're quickly shown some pretty shocking stuff. First of all, Tidus originally had black hair, and it actually bounces and animates as he moves. In fact, when he stops walking, it appears to be blowing in the wind a little bit. Not only that, but his clothes appear to have pretty good cloth simulation applied to them as well. So why were things like this removed? Well, Tidus having black hair is a bit contradictory. While many English speakers thought his name was pronounced Tidus, a reference to the tide, it actually comes from the Okinawan word Tida. Tida means sun, and Yuna means moon. Thus, it only made sense to create a sense of contrast between them. And since Tida means sun, it just made more sense to have him be blonde. As for the hair and cloth simulations, games oftentimes begin development for the next generation consoles on PC first. Then, as the console manufacturer, in this case Sony, sends them the development kits, they can simply begin to port all their work into the next generation console, allowing them to go ahead and get started on the game without having to wait on the kits. Third-party developers are usually sent a rough estimation of what the specs of the new console will be like, and they test this in an environment roughly equivalent to those specs. And oftentimes these specs end up being adjusted before release. After all, does anyone else remember that the PlayStation 3 was supposed to have dual monitor support? And in the end, it proved too much for the PlayStation 2 to handle. There was also a camera that was dynamically controllable by the user. I'm not sure why they removed this in favor of fixed camera angles. It's possible this was done to save polygons, only having to show one angle of an environment. Or perhaps it was to keep continuity with the few environments that were pre-rendered in the game. In either case, this feature was definitely missed in the final game. Map director Nakazato wanted to implement a world map concept with a much more realistic approach than what had been used in a traditional Final Fantasy game, and create something that was much more in line with the realism of the 3D backgrounds, as opposed to only using pre-rendered backgrounds again. Originally, Final Fantasy X was going to feature wandering enemies visible on the field map, seamless transitions in the battle, and the option for the player to move around the landscape during enemy encounters. Battle art director Shintaro Takai has explained that it was his intention that battles in Final Fantasy X come across as a natural part of the story and not an independent element. However, due to hardware limitations, this idea was not used. Instead, a compromise was made, whereby some transitions from the field map to the battle map were made relatively seamless. Though these ideas of being able to see enemies on the world map or have battle encounters happen on the field map would eventually resurface in Final Fantasy XII. Next we see the game's menus, which look fairly similar to what we got in the final game, with the exception of the Play Online feature, which was an online gaming service created by Square. As you can see, when you connect to Play Online, you can see what appears to be a map pop up. You can also view some cool information about enemies as well. The point of this feature was to be sort of like an online guidebook, and Square would be the ones providing support for it directly. Another notable thing here is that characters seem to have traditional levels, not an S level, as it pretty explicitly just says level here, and there's no option for a sphere grid in the menu. Despite a standard leveling system being used at some point, this was done away with. Kitase explaining that the purpose of the sphere grid was to give player an interactive means of increasing their character's attributes, such that they'll be able to observe the development of those attributes firsthand. And that's how we ended up getting the sphere grid. There are, however, load and save options on the menu, implying that at one point in time you might have been able to load and save at any point. Although it's possible that this option was available in your menu when nearing a save point and touching it like older Final Fantasy titles. Though we had not seen much of Final Fantasy X pre-release, in May 2009, a preview build of the game was shown off by an online user who goes by the name of Lionheart. When this preview build of the English version of Final Fantasy X was leaked online, it brought some interesting new discoveries. It has a debug mode in the main menu, and the FMVs are still in Japanese. This build is about 2 months before the final release, so while it is mostly complete, there are still some small changes here and there with translation. You can also find a lot of weird things in these menus, like this ultra strange debug cutscene that is kind of disturbing. I literally do not understand what's going on here. These are really weird. So Ultima Weapons, would you have preferred a black-haired Tidus? Or are you happy with the game that we got? Subscribe, click the bell icon, and let me know in the comments below. And if you really love Final Fantasy X, I mean really love Final Fantasy X, be sure to join our Facebook group, Ultima, Square Enix plus JRPGs, the only place where you can be with a woman even if you can't catch a ball. Link in the description below.